Born into slavery around May or June of 1773, Ona Marie Judge was the daughter of Betty, an enslaved seamstress, and Andrew Judge, an indentured servant, at Mount Vernon, the Virginia home of George and Martha Washington. Sometime after Ona turned 10 years old, she was brought to the mansion to serve as the personal body servant of Martha Washington. As a personal body servant, Ona would have used many objects like these in her duties. She would have had to learn to sew and mend on fabrics such as these clothes made of linen, silk, and wool. She would be expected to draw Martha's bath, tend to her when ill, and she would have had to comb and style her hair both day and night, using combs similar to this one. She would have been required to travel with Mrs. Washington on social outings, prepare her night clothes, and overseeing the care and cleaning of her clothing, brushing the dirt off with a laundry brush such as this one, and cleaning them with this soap that's made of lye and animal fat. She would be expected to be available not only to Mrs. Washington, but also her grandchildren, both day and night, regardless of Ona's own personal requirements. In May of 1789, when she was 16 years old, Ona was informed that she would be traveling with the Washingtons and 6 other enslaved people to New York, where President Washington would be sworn in as the first president. Shortly after, in 1790, the entire household moved again to Philadelphia, the newly designated capital of the United States. As president, Washington moved here to the president's mansion. The residence was a former home of American merchant and financier Robert Morris, who was a friend of the Washingtons. The household was very crowded, as up to 30 people at one time lived at the residence, including indentured servants and the families of the president's staff. The world that Ona would have seen from this house would have been far different than her life at Mount Vernon or even New York City. Philadelphia had the largest number of free people of African descent than any other American city. With a population of 44,000 people in Philadelphia by 1790, with 5%, or roughly 2,000, being people of African descent. Ona would have the ability to leave the house to run errands for the Washingtons. It was in these moments that Ona had the opportunity to interact with people of African descent in the city. Ona would have had the opportunity to see the work that free people of color would have been doing here in Philadelphia, including the work as artisans, vendors, selling foods such as pepper pot soup and oysters on the streets. She would have learned about the work of Richard Allen and Absalom Jones in creating the Free African Society, a mutual aid organization that represented the first organized body that sought to benefit people of African descent. The population was growing rapidly in Philadelphia and throughout the state, in part because Pennsylvania was the first state to have a gradual abolition act on the books in 1780. This act required enslavers from other states to register their enslaved people within 6 months of moving to Pennsylvania, and then requiring their emancipation within another 6 months. When Washington learned that this law also applied to the president and his household, they concocted a plan with the president's executive secretary, Tobias Lear, to rotate their enslaved household servants out the house every 6 months so that upon their return, the clock was reset on their residency and their enslavement. It was also in this house that Ona probably learned of her involuntary fate. In 1796, news arrived that Martha's granddaughter, Elizabeth Parke Custis, intended to marry British businessman Thomas Law. This union was a surprise to the Washingtons, so they decided to gift Ona to Eliza to help her set up the household. Ona knew from tending to Eliza as a child that she was prone to tantrums and violent outbursts, and that her intended husband had a similar abusive reputation. With her time in Philadelphia ending soon, she decided that her only choice was escape. Ona picked May 21st, 1796 as her day to escape the house. She knew that the Washingtons would have a dinner party, so she picked this time to escape. Ona only had a few changes of clothes and the money that was gifted to her by the Washingtons. Ona would have had enough money saved to make the journey, but it was still very dangerous for a 23-year-old woman of African descent to travel unaccompanied. The passage of the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act also presented Ona with the challenge that if caught, she would go before a local court that would return her to the Washingtons. This law also made it a crime to aid the escape of an enslaved person with heavy fines and jail time. It is not known whom Ona contacted within the Black community that may have aided in her escape. There is evidence that Richard Allen did have contact with the president for services rendered. This may have been the link that Ona would have needed to communicate her desire to escape. Ona also could have relayed a message in her travels as Martha Washington's bondwoman. Long before the Underground Railroad, pockets of free blacks aided those enslaved in preparing for their escape. She would have boarded the ship the Nancy here at what is today known as Penn's Landing. The sloop was actually captained by John Bowles and was headed on a 5-day trip to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. She would quickly find a job as a paid domestic servant and later would meet and marry John Staines in 1797, and they would have 3 children. Life in New Hampshire was not always a quiet respite for Ona. When the Washingtons discovered her escape, they immediately placed advertisements in local papers offering rewards for information that would lead to her capture. By August of 1796, the Washingtons knew where she was and sent 2 different parties to New Hampshire over the course of 3 years to kidnap her and bring her back to Virginia. Using connections that she made in her new community, she was able to evade the attempts both times. It wasn't until George Washington dies in 1799 that the slave catchers stopped their attempts. Ona carved out a quiet life in New Hampshire, only coming forward in 1845 to tell her story of enslavement to an abolitionist newspaper. She only did this when she knew that most of the people who might have known about her story had passed on. There is not much in the way of physical objects left of Ona's life. She passed away in 1848, which was after the death of her husband and all 3 of her children. The house she escaped from was gutted in 1832 and then fully demolished in 1951. The belongings that she left there were most likely sold off and scattered amongst enslaved people still left in the home. But in our collection at the museum, we have one object that connects to her story. This door handle from the president's house. Could this handle be the last thing Ona touched as she took the radical act of freeing herself? Did she hesitate as she turned this handle, not knowing how this decision would work? We'll never know. But thanks to her own words and the work of historians, we know about Ona Judge and her courageous story. We know that on a warm May night in 1796, in a city where revolution and independence were forged, a 23-year-old black woman decided that breaking the law was the revolutionary act she needed to make to declare her independence.